Okay, thank you, David, for being here with us. It's really a pleasure to have you. I'm going to quickly introduce the film and then jump straight into questions right in the deep end, as we only have about a half an hour. So by way of introduction, this is an incredible film. It's called Welcome to Chechnya. Would you like to introduce it?
I could say that it's a film about an ongoing humanitarian crisis in the southern region of Russia, about which the world has paid much too little attention. But it's also a story about the activists on the ground who, because of this lack of international political pressure, have had to take matters into their own hands. So it's a chronicle of the work that they're doing within the LGBTQ community in the south of Russia.
Thank you. So I'll just jump right in. Whenever one makes a documentary, there's always like a bunch of ethical questions that we have to address as filmmakers. In this case, what were some of the toughest ethical questions that you might have encountered?
Well, this one certainly had more ethical challenges, I think, than any film that I'd worked on before. The first was whether or not it could actually be made. Would it be possible to tell the story of this underground network of activism that is actually finding people, rescuing people, saving people, and getting them to safety? Would it be possible to film that in any way without exposing them? And that took a great amount of kind of practice and study and strategizing to develop the protocols that we, ultimately settled on, that allowed us to enter those networks and leave those networks with footage that might also reveal who they are and where they are and what they're doing in safe ways. And then the bigger ethical question for me was where the people who are escaping these tortures, the survivors, are being hunted wherever they go. And they said to me that they couldn't have their faces in a film. And I asked them to let me film them and let me try and find a way to cover their faces that would not reduce their humanity or abridge their story in any way, and that would allow the audience to understand the consequences of this kind of horror that's happening in Chechnya. And many people did say that they would allow me to do it. And I realized that ethically, there was a question of the difference for me between consent and informed consent. Did they really know what it was going to mean to be in the film? And so I returned to them time and time and time again to get their consent again, to tell them more about what I thought was going to be the reality of a film coming out, how it might impact their lives, and to also work with them to make sure they knew exactly how I was covering them and accepted that that met their standards of maintaining their anonymity.
And I also noticed that you've used, and you've talked about this extensively, deepfake technology, what you refer to as digital disguises. Could you tell our viewers a little bit about that, please?
Well, it's what I discovered after I filmed everybody and got back to my studio is that the toolbox for documentary filmmakers for covering people's identities is very limited. And, it's blurring and pixelating and black bars and throwing people into darkness. It's making their voices into pushing them through mechanical filters so they sound machine-like. And it worked against what I had hoped this film would do, which would be to let people have their humanity back, let people have their regain their voice and regain their power to tell their own stories. And so ultimately, we found this approach to the technology which can produce a deep fake, and that's an artificial intelligence that allows manipulation in certain ways. And I didn't want to change anything about what I had seen. I just wanted to change the way it looked. And what we settled on and were able to devise for the first time with this technology is the ability to take some third party's face and through these digital means stretch that face over the face of the person who's in the film. So it changes nothing about what's going on in the film. None of the expressions are micro expressions. None of this, no blinking eye is changed. What's changed is the skin and the appearance of the skin. And literally, I went to 23 people and unassociated with the film and asked them if they would lend me their faces as shields. And we put those 23 faces over 23 people in the film to protect them, to render them unrecognizable entirely. And that's the technique we settled on. It was time consuming. It took over 10 months for the work to be done. And but I think that the effect is to allow you and me to watch them, to be with them in their lives, to feel for them, to have a human empathetic connection to them, even while putting them behind an impenetrable screen that protects their identity.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that stayed with me is their body language, because you can't really see them. So you're kind of guessing at who they are. But I don't think you've changed the body, or at least from the end reveal, it doesn't appear as though you've changed the body at all. And the incredible moments of intimacy, actually, that you've captured, which I think in silhouette or pixelated form, it would have been totally lost.
It would have been.
So that was absolutely fantastic. But as I was reading your press kit, I also read you worked with a Dr. Wheatley. How did what she contributed, or how did her research contribute to the process?
Well, that's an interesting subject, So when we started entering into the really kind of forward edge of VFX and artificial intelligence and changing people's identities, we started to worry about this thing they call the uncanny valley. This idea that that sometimes sometimes digital manipulations or other present representations push the viewer away more than pull them in. And although it looked pretty good to me when we were first settling on this as an approach, I didn't know how an audience was going to react. We tried kind of 4 different varieties of this AI face transfer. And I just didn't know how to decide which was going to work the best. And I thought we should ask an expert in the uncanny valley. So that's who Professor Wheatley is. She runs a neuropsych lab at a university. And she's well known for her work on studying human connections and connectivity and empathy. And so she was just, she said she'd never received the kind of email that I sent her, which was to say, could you help me further disguise people to save their lives? And she immediately said yes. And she enrolled a study with 120 of her students and presented our 4 approaches to see which ones succeeded and which ones failed. And that helped us realize that we were onto something, and that in fact the one approach, the approach that's in the film, is the one that scored the highest. And so, I don't know, we went to science. We used science in our determination of how to understand this really artistic and technological approach.
Yeah, and a very human sort of approach. So congratulations for that.
Thank you.
I also, with documentary filmmaking, there's also a balance always to be struck between the content versus the aesthetic. And in this case, you are in, small apartments. Sometimes you're on the streets. How do you strike that balance? I know that mostly we chase content and the moments and the expressions, but there's always something within us, because we are visual storytellers, that's chasing that visual. How did you strike that balance in this story? Well,
for the most part, we couldn't be, that's not for the most part, no one could know we were making this film. And so that meant we didn't and couldn't use any professional equipment. We certainly couldn't have, an enormous camera on somebody's shoulder. We couldn't have, somebody standing with a boom. We couldn't use a sound engineer in any way. And I had a partner in Russia, Askol Kurov, who was the producer. And we settled on just consumer cameras to shoot inside the shelter system, because we could carry them inside in our bag without having, a big camera apparatus to drag with us. And outside we shot with GoPros and cell phones for the most part. So I had to just lean into that look. Here was a look that was going to be very flat, very rough. Some of those scenes are shot on the run with a cell phone, so it's as sloppy as you can imagine. And so in post, we worked with that. We decided that was our aesthetic. That's what told our story. I made sure to shoot everything in 4K to give us something to work with in color. But here was a story of a life on the run in the underground, and those tools produced the images that you would imagine would accompany that story. So in a way, they were made for each other.
And the irony with putting anything on film, and as it's a covert sort of operation, is that suddenly it gets a lot of exposure. You would have thought about this a million times before actually even hitting the record button on any camera. How did you get to that point?
When I first heard about what they were up to and up against, and knowing it was in Russia, and knowing what little I knew about queer life in Russia, I knew that they were in deep trouble. And I knew also that this is a story that really can't be told from Russia. It's certainly a film that couldn't be filmed by Russians in Russia because of all the risks and the laws. It's illegal to tell stories about LGBTQ people in Russia that presents them as healthy. It's illegal. So I reached out and made an introduction to Olga Baranova, who's in the film, who runs the main shelter system. And I said, can I help? Can I do something as a documentary filmmaker that might help? And she said, giving all the caveats about how hard it will be to convince people to appear on camera. Yes, indeed, she needed the help. The organizations needed the help. And so that's how I began. Now, I said before, there were all these safety protocols that we had to put in place. And the first was, anytime you record something on that card in the camera, it becomes discoverable by people who might want to take that away from you. So we immediately moved the footage onto encrypted drives, and we immediately overwrote the cards in the cameras. It wasn't enough just to delete those cards. We wrote data on top of that so that the information there could never be retrieved. And it was very cumbersome to meet these kind of standards of secrecy and security and safety. But we worked with the people at the shelter. We worked with David Esteve, who's in the film, who's the security leader for the organization, at every step of the way to make sure that we were not endangering people. And that was our prime directive.
And did the writer of the story, the original writer, Misha, I believe is the name, did you work together at all?
Masha Gessen is a journalist, a very well-known journalist inside Russia and in the United States. They wrote the first piece coming out of the shelter system. First and only piece, I think, that I've seen. They were right for the New Yorker. I reached out to Masha, whom I'd known for many years, and invited them to join me in this project as executive producer, and they agreed right away. It was very helpful for me because because of the level of respect that Masha has already built in amongst the community of social justice folks inside Russia, also especially in the queer community there, and then also they had this intense, deep knowledge of politics and culture within Russia as it relates to Chechnya, and their advice was very important and key for me as I was moving into the edit for the film.
And one of the greatest challenges I face is you often film with many characters, but in the edit, you have to make the decisions to leave some of them out. Was that something you had to do for this film as well? Was it just like, I'll take what I get and run with it?
You know the heartbreak then of having to make those decisions. And I did have to make those decisions. And there are multiple stories that were at one point in the film, in early versions of the film. Of course, those early versions were 3 and 4 and 5 hours long. Not the film that anyone would want to sit down and watch. And then those are the decisions, I think, more than the visual ones that you were asking me about before. Those emotional decisions are so hard when you realize that cinema requires you to overcome and overrule your own emotions, right? So in order to make this into a movie, I have to move from my own heart to the other side of the screen and see it that way for the first time, and feel what each of the characters is teaching me. And in this case, I had to remove 3 of some of the favorite people I've met in my life, who shared such intense truths with me, hoping to reach an audience with those truths. And it was so difficult for me to have to make that decision, and then to have to convey that to them, to have to reach out to them and say, I am so sorry. It just didn't work. And I have made their footage available to them. Like, I have these wonderful scenes. These little mini movies that they're in, that I could not release otherwise because they're not disguised in them, but I could certainly share them with the people who are in the film. And so that's what I was in the process of doing when COVID came and sent us all home. So.
And there must have been a personal transformation, I'm guessing, that took place within you as you were going through this process. Something must have shifted, as it always does.
Well, I think that's true, but I think on this film, more than any film I've ever worked on, I really fell in love. Wow. I fell in love with the people that I met, and I've been a journalist for a long time, and I've done deep dive stories for many decades, actually, and I've never felt the kind of connectedness that I feel to the people in this film. I mean, sometimes we get in fights, sometimes we don't talk. It's that kind of, we've become this kind of family. I guess that's what was forged there is this family that of people who had been strangers and now are these essential members of my life in ways that I hope will continue to inform me and transform me over the years.
Thank you. That's a beautiful thought. And I think we'll end with that. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, thank you for letting me end on the love story, because that's what I think this film is really all about. It's a horror. It's a genocide. It's the first time since Hitler that a government has been rounding up LGBTQ people for extermination anywhere in the world. It's all of that, but it's real. It's the bigger truth is that it's a story about love. The love that the people are hoping to express, and that's being repressed by this campaign, and the love of these total strangers who have come in from their ordinary lives as school teachers and newspaper reporters and advertising executives. They've left those lives behind to build this underground network, just out of this incredible sense of human love. And that is just the most remarkable thing I think I've ever been able to witness.
I'm jealous, and thank you so much. Thank you, really. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
I hope you keep at it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.